1976, somewhere in the Soviet Union's western military districts. A new vehicle appears in reconnaissance photographs that Western intelligence analysts had not seen before. It is tracked. It sits on a modified T-80 tank chassis. Its gun barrel extends so far beyond the front of the vehicle that it makes the vehicle look unbalanced, almost architectural, as if someone had attached a small building's structural column to a tank and called it done. The barrel is 203 millimeters wide. It is 11.3 meters long. A single shell weighs 110 kilograms. When it fires, the recoil is so violent that the entire vehicle moves backward. The crew of 14 cannot stay inside when it fires because the overpressure inside the fighting compartment would rupture eardrums and potentially rupture lungs. They step out, stand at a designated safe distance, and fire the gun remotely. Then they get back in and drive away. NATO designated it the M110. The Soviets called it the 2S7 Pion, Piony in Russian, a name that sits alongside the violence of the weapon, with the same irony as the Schwerer Gustav being named a mouse. Its official primary mission, written into the Soviet military doctrine it was designed to support, was not to destroy conventional targets. It was to deliver tactical nuclear warheads to a depth of 47 kilometers behind NATO's front line. The most powerful self-propelled artillery system ever deployed in combat had been designed to fire nuclear weapons. In Ukraine today, with nuclear warheads removed and conventional shells loaded, both Russian and Ukrainian Pions are doing what they were always capable of doing, destroying reinforced concrete bunkers, command posts, and hardened facilities at ranges that conventional artillery cannot reach. The Piony is in bloom. To understand what the 2S7 Pion was, you need to understand what Soviet nuclear artillery doctrine looked like in the early 1970s. The Warsaw Pact's operational planning for a war in Europe centered on a deep battle concept. Echeloned forces attacking in successive waves, with the first echelon breaking through NATO's forward defenses, the second exploiting the breakthrough, and the third driving for the Rhine. The problem was NATO's depth of defense, the ability to rotate fresh divisions into the battle from rear areas that Soviet conventional artillery could not reach. The solution that Soviet doctrine had adopted since the 1950s was tactical nuclear weapons, battlefield nuclear warheads delivered by artillery, rockets, and aircraft that would destroy the formations in NATO's second and third echelons before they could be committed. The existing 152mm self-propelled artillery in Soviet service, the 2S3 Akatsiya, could fire nuclear shells to a range of approximately 17 kilometers. That was not far enough. The NATO rear areas that needed to be destroyed were 40 to 50 kilometers back. A new weapon was needed. The Kyiv factory developed the chassis. The Barakati plant developed the gun. The result was a 46-ton vehicle carrying a gun that could deliver a nuclear shell to 47 kilometers with a crew of 14 who had been trained to step away from it before it fired. The 203cc A44 gun barrel alone weighed 14.5 tons. The entire vehicle weighed 46.5 tons. Setting up the firing position required 5 to 6 minutes, leaving it required 3 to 5 minutes. The 4 shells carried on the vehicle itself, later 8 on the 2S7M, were supplemented by an accompanying ammunition carrier because the crew could not physically move 110-kilogram shells without mechanical assistance. The autoloader that fed shells into the breech was a complex hydraulic system that could malfunction in the field conditions of Eastern Europe in winter. The vehicle had no secondary armament of any significance. Its crew of 14 had no protection against small arms fire or shell fragments once they stepped outside. Its 10 millimeters of armor protected against small caliber fire and nothing else. The 2S7 was not a vehicle designed to fight its way to a position. It was designed to be delivered to a prepared position by the Soviet logistics system, fire its nuclear or conventional shells at distant hardened targets, and be replaced if lost. It was expendable in the way that Soviet doctrine always accepted that individual weapon systems were expendable, because Soviet doctrine counted on mass to compensate for individual losses. The conventional ammunition available to the 2S7 reflected its mission. The standard high-explosive fragmentation round at 110 kilograms produced a crater approximately 8 meters wide and 4 meters deep on impact. A single round could collapse a standard reinforced concrete observation post or command bunker. The rocket-assisted projectile extended range to 47.5 kilometers at the cost of some terminal velocity and accuracy. The concrete-piercing round was designed to penetrate hardened aircraft shelters, ammunition bunkers, and command facility ceilings, against any target that a normal artillery shell could not effectively defeat. Against the hardened NATO infrastructure that Soviet planners most wanted to destroy, the 2S7's conventional rounds were devastating precisely because their mass and velocity gave them penetration energy that lighter shells could not achieve. A 110-kilogram shell arriving at 960 meters per second carries approximately 50 megajoules of kinetic energy on impact. That number is not intuitive, but the physical effect is. It goes through things that smaller shells bounce off. The Tu-7's operational career before Ukraine was limited by its requirements. It needs flat terrain with load-bearing capacity sufficient for a 46-ton vehicle. It needs a prepared firing position. It needs a crew of 14 who can work together under fire conditions while standing outside the vehicle. Afghanistan confirmed the terrain limitation. The mountains made the system almost impossible to deploy, and the few documented uses were primarily psychological. The enormous sound of the 203mm firing producing an effect on mujahideen positions that had little to do with the round's accuracy. Chechnya saw Pions used in the systematic destruction of Grozny in 1994-95. Their concrete-piercing rounds applied to the buildings of a city rather than the hardened NATO facilities they had been designed for. The Georgia War of 2008 saw Russian Tu-7s deployed but produced no significant documented engagement record. Ukraine changed everything. When Russia invaded in February 2022, both sides, Russia and Ukraine, had Tu-7 Pion systems in their inventories. Ukraine's 43rd Artillery Brigade had 12 Tu-7 Pions defending Kyiv in the early weeks of the war. 12 guns against a Russian advance supported by thousands of armored vehicles. The scale of the mismatch was total, and yet those 12 guns contributed to the defense because at 47 kilometers range, they could reach Russian staging areas and supply concentrations that no other Ukrainian artillery system could touch. When the Russian advance on Kyiv collapsed in late March 2022, the 43rd Brigade's Tu-7s had fired through their entire ammunition stockpile and faced a shortage that led to one of the war's stranger logistical solutions. Ukraine began using 53 G620 Fidishi 620 projectiles designed for World War II-era B420mm howitzers because the shells were the right caliber even if the propellant charges were not optimized for the Tu-7's gun. Then the United States provided 10,000 rounds of M106 23mm ammunition, rounds designed for the American M110 self-propelled howitzer, which fires the same caliber. A Soviet gun designed to deliver nuclear warheads against NATO was now firing American ammunition in defense of a country that wanted to join NATO. The shell that had been developed to kill the alliance was keeping it alive. Russian Tu-7M Malka systems, the upgraded variant with improved fire control, GLONASS navigation, and a rate of fire of 2.5 rounds per minute, have been used throughout the war in the role the system was always designed for, destroying hardened Ukrainian command posts, ammunition bunkers, and fortified positions at ranges that Russian 152mm artillery cannot reach. The open crew positions that expose the 14-man team during loading operations have proven highly vulnerable to Ukrainian drone reconnaissance and counter-battery fire. Several Russian Tu-7Ms have been destroyed not by the impact of incoming shells, but by Ukrainian FPV drones attacking the crew during the loading sequence, when the men are standing outside the vehicle in the open. The vulnerability was always there in the design. Soviet doctrine had never expected the crew to be under drone surveillance while loading. No artillery system of the 1970s had been designed for a battlefield where a $500 commercial drone could watch every movement of a 14-man crew at a range of 5 kilometers and direct ammunition onto the most exposed one. The Tu-7 represents the furthest point that the Soviet tradition of large-caliber artillery ever reached in a mobile deployable form. The Schwerer Gustav fired 800mm shells from a fixed railway position that required 2,500 men and 5 weeks to prepare. The Tu-7 fires 250 shells from a 46-ton tracked vehicle that can deploy in 6 minutes and relocate in 5. The compromise between those two extremes, maximum destructive power in a mobile, crew-operated platform, had produced something genuinely remarkable, a system that could destroy hardened targets at 47 kilometers while being operated by a crew that could drive it away before the counter-battery response arrived. The nuclear warheads that had been the system's primary purpose were never used. The conventional shells that had been the secondary capability became the weapon's entire identity. And in Ukraine, on both sides simultaneously, the peony that the Soviets had grown to destroy NATO is being used to destroy the concrete and steel of a war that neither side had fully prepared for and neither side can cleanly win. The Tu-7 Pion is not a subtle weapon. It is 10.5 meters long, weighs 46 tons, requires 14 crew, fires a shell heavier than a grown man at a target nearly 50 kilometers away, and was designed to end a war by nuclear means if conventional means failed. It was built in this form, this enormous, impractical, awe-inspiring form, because the Soviet Union believed that the next war in Europe would be decided by who could destroy the other side's rear areas faster and more completely. That war never happened. The Pion outlasted it, and now, on the Ukrainian steppe, The gun that was built to end NATO is firing American shells in NATO's defense. That is not irony. That is what happens to weapons when history does not go according to plan.